radical, and never-failing providence. We say with the prophet Samuel, "Speak, Lord, for we, your servants, are listening."
Amen. Yes.
Amen.
Amen.
My grandmother, Mama, as I affectionately call her, is now 87 years old. Several years ago, she willfully renounced her independence and moved in with my mom and dad. She is still in really good physical health, although she now walks with a rolling walker for added stability. But she will be the first to tell you that her 87-year-old mind is simply not what it used to be. I have even watched her rely heavily on scrap paper and a pen as she takes notes from even the simplest of telephone conversations, lest she forgets what was said. But when it comes to recounting the stories of her childhood and teenage years, stories shaped by the years of the Great Depression and World War II, she can still recount them with such pristine clarity, it's almost as if they happened yesterday. As long as Mama is still able and willing to share those stories, I want to listen to them. A little over a month ago, while I was at home visiting family, over the Memorial Day weekend, I found myself a day home alone, spent one-on-one with Mama. And I invited her to share those stories with me once again. And for hours, she told me stories about a strong, a hard work ethic, a sense of real generosity, incomprehensible resourcefulness. Nothing went to waste, and profound and real gratitude. And the common thread that wove all of these stories together was a radical dependence on the providence of God.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother is 87 years old, and in less than 2 weeks I will turn 25 years old. As I hear the stories about her early life, I can't help but feel some disconnect between her story and mine. You see, I grew up in a world of direct deposit. I've grown up in a world of 401ks. I've grown up in a world of stock portfolios. I have grown up in a world and in a culture, in a society where economists repeatedly say, there is enough. There is abundance. As my grandmother tells me about the dependence her and her family had on God's providence, our culture hears those stories and it is almost rendered obsolete. You see, while our currency may have minted on it, "In God we trust," our culture and our society tends to put more trust in the currency than in the God minted on it.
Awesome.
And while there may not necessarily be anything wrong with stock portfolios and 401ks, when we begin to turn our assets into treasure, then something has gone awry. Because trust and treasure go hand in hand.
That's right.
How many of you, just out of curiosity, have read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship? Many of you. Well, in The Cost of Discipleship, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says in a very Bonhoefferian way, the heart clings to collected treasure. Stored up possessions get between me and God. Where my treasure is, there is my trust, my security, my comfort, my God. Treasure means idolatry. So, my brothers and sisters, why then is it so difficult for us to trust in the providence of God? Call it what you will. The human condition, our baser instincts, original sin. It's our human problem. We want to be in charge of everything. We want to be in control. We want to call all the shots. But for those of us who would follow Jesus, Jesus calls us to a radically different way of life. He calls us to trust in a radical God whose providence is just as radical. In the Sermon on the Mount, where our reading this afternoon was taken, Jesus outlines the marks of the new community he came to create. And in doing so, he takes the ways of our world and turns them on their ear. He calls his followers to consider the ways of nature, the lilies of the field, the birds of the air. Brothers and sisters, there is nothing radical about flowers and birds. But he uses such a simple image to say, how much more will God care for you? Jesus reminds us God cares for us and wants us to put our trust in God and in God's providence. A few chapters over in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus poses the question, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. But the very hairs of your head are numbered. Therefore, do not be afraid. You are more valuable than many sparrows. Jesus' words are meant to encourage us. They're meant to comfort us, for trusting God is a joy. And while it sounds so basic, it is not necessarily always the easiest thing to do.
That's right.
It comes with challenges, and it comes with very serious challenges. And it often calls us out of our comfort zones. Perhaps no other biblical figure illustrates this more perfectly than Abraham. In Genesis chapter 22, God comes to Abraham and tells Abraham to sacrifice the son whom he loves, the son of promise, the son of the covenant, Isaac. Take this son of yours and sacrifice him to me. As the story unfolds, as Abraham is preparing to sacrifice Isaac, he not once but twice expresses his trust in the providence of God. He tells his entourage, the boy and I will go over yonder and worship. And then do you remember what Abraham says? And then we will return to you. He then tells his son Isaac, we have all the equipment we need for the sacrifice, but where is the offering? Isaac asks. And Abraham responds, my son, God will provide for himself a burnt offering. The more I think about that passage, the more I become convinced that whether or not Abraham trusted in God's providence, Isaac would have still lived. There was absolutely no way Abraham was going to come down off of that mountain without his son, but on whose authority?
Wow.
Abraham's or God's? You see, my brothers and sisters, we are all just like Abraham. because sometimes we too can fall into the trap of loving our blessings more than the one who blesses us.
Wow. Yes, sir.
But our call is to love God, to make God our treasure, and to keep His commandments. For love and treasure, love and trust go hand in hand. And so for all of us sitting here this afternoon, Jesus once again calls us to consider the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. He invites us to see how God cares even for them and how much more God cares for us. My grandmother's dependence on God's providence was cultivated in the fields of hard work, generosity, resourcefulness, and gratitude. And still the Holy Spirit comes to us and calls us to cultivate our own fields. What fields might the Holy Spirit be calling you to cultivate? For we are all invited to place our trust in God's radical providence. For is not life worth much more than direct deposits, 401ks, and stock portfolios?
Yeah.
God is the giver of all good things. We trust in a radical God whose providence is just as radical. My brothers and sisters, what a radical idea.
Amen.
Amen.